live. What did he say? What's the last thing in your notes?
U.S. provided no air support.
Ooh, you guys are behind.
Oh, I missed that.
Oh yeah, we're gonna start with the video, right? About the Bay of Pigs, or we saw the video. You did not see Bay of Pigs video?
No.
Man, we gotta get moving. Seriously,
Facts.
you are so behind.
Our quiz might have to.
Yeah. Hello, the Silver Guard here to explain our cashback.
I feel like told them they walked in like this is Monday.
That has nothing to do with the presidential quiz.
I don't know.
Yeah, presidents can change.
You never know, bro.
Yeah,
Trump could be back on.
All right, here we go. Lights, please. That Bay of Pigs that you've written notes about, strange name, but again, it was named after the bay in southern Cuba where the invasion took place.
And the Daily News, Bay of Pigs invasion. Covertly funded by the CIA, the three-day Bay of Pigs invasion would prove to be a disaster for the Kennedy administration, going down as one of the most glaring failures in CIA history. In 1952, American ally General Fulgencio Batista led a coup against Cuban President Carlos Prio, forcing Prio to flee the island nation into exile in nearby Miami. The overthrow inspired Fidel Castro to form the 26 July movement, which would escalate into the Cuban Revolution of December 1958. Once in power, Castro nationalized all American business.
If you didn't catch that first 30 seconds, basically in a nutshell, what happened was Cuba had one leader. Listen, facts are America wanted a different leader in Cuba, 90 miles off our shore. So this is one of the reasons that people have, you'll hear people talk about history in America and we're not the greatest country. We do all the, well, we declared a long time ago with the Monroe Doctrine, right? That we controlled this area of the world. So we helped get the Batista guy installed as the leader of Cuba 8 years before. And then that led to some people being more motivated to bring forth their idea of how Cuba should be run, like Fidel Castro, and it was communist. So that was what that was saying. Fact of the matter is, we had communism 90 miles away.
Interest on the island, including banks, oil refineries, as well as sugar and coffee plantations, before severing previously close relations with the United States. In its place, Castro embraced relations with America's Cold War rival, the Soviet Union. In response, U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower allocated $13.1 million to the CIA in March 1960 for direct use against the Castro regime. The money helped to form a Cuban exile paramilitary group called Brigade 2506, an armed wing of the Democratic Revolutionary Front, whose sole objective was the overthrow of Castro's increasingly communistic-backed regime. Aided by the CIA and strategic U.S. military personnel, the counter-revolutionary unit of 1,400 Cuban paramilitaries was trained in Guatemala. On April 17, 1961, the newly minted President John F. Kennedy allowed the invasion attempt to go forward. However, he stripped the mission of direct support of U.S. air and naval assets, which almost certainly doomed the invasion attempt to failure. 2 days earlier, 8 CIA-supplied B-26 bombers had attacked Cuban airfields, allowing the invasion force to land uncontested on a beach in Playa Girón in the Bay of Pigs, where it was soon overwhelmed by local Cuban militias. Within 3 days, the invaders had been defeated and thrown into Cuban prisons. The 3-day Bay of Pigs invasion would prove to be a disaster for the Kennedy administration, going down as one of the most glaring failures in CIA history. On September 12, 1962, many historians believe that Kennedy's "Let's Go to the Moon" speech was a belated attempt to deflect attention from his mistakes during the Bay of Pigs invasion while his inept understanding about the geopolitical importance of Cuba would go on to spawn the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962.
Which we'll get to, hopefully today, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is another crisis in Cuba due to the fact that communism has taken foot 90 miles from our shore. And you notice in the video, there always is, politics, right? Like, hey, Kennedy only made a big deal about going into to the moon by the end of the decade because there were still people talking about the colossal failure of the Bay of Pigs. And since, remember, he only got elected by 0.1% of the vote, you had half the country like, see, I told you so. You can't put this young guy in charge during a Cold War. We're trying to stave off communism taking over the whole world. And you put this young guy, this Catholic young person, and he can't handle this. So they were all saying, of course, I told you so. Look what happened. What a failure this was. Questions, comments? The first 100 days of President Kennedy's administration. Space race, the Bay of Pigs. He did establish the Peace Corps. Brings us to more challenges for Kennedy. What were the two biggest challenges? The Cold War, which the space race is part of, and race, right? Civil rights legislation, segregation, desegregation. What are we going to do about these southern states that won't let go of the Civil War? It should be noted that it was in 1961, in case you thought maybe they built the Berlin Wall right after World War II. That wall wasn't actually constructed. There were still all kinds of ongoing negotiations about Berlin itself, Germany. Remember at the end of World War II, they split Germany and Berlin into 4 different pieces. Well, now we got resolution. August 13th, 1961, the Soviets decide, you know what, we're just going to put a wall right through the middle of Berlin. And on this side is our ideas, and the West, we're going to keep you out. Of course, nobody from the West is going to try to jump over the wall to get to the East. Although many people died trying to get from the East to the West, which makes sense. Also, 1962, February 3rd. Speaking of birthdays, that's Bryce's birthday. February 3rd, 1962, we officially end all trade ties with Cuba. By the way, if you noticed in the video, you heard, if you were paying keen attention, that Castro nationalized all the businesses in Cuba. What's that mean? That means the national government in Cuba took over all the businesses. What's that mean? That means if your family had business investments in Cuba, guess what? They're gone. He just took them over. And believe me, a lot of Americans had a lot of investments going on in Cuba. I talked about the fact that it was a very popular tourist place, a place where a lot of business people would go, and you wanted to entertain someone, a new client. Hey, go down to that beautiful paradise island called Cuba and let's do business. And it was a really happening place in the 50s until the communists took over. Desegregation continues to be an issue. Unfortunately, most of the news is bad leading up to 1965. You had a man named James Meredith. He had this really weird idea in America. He thought, I want to go to the University of Mississippi. And when the federal court sought to actually attend the university, he's met by a mob of violent protesters, because who would have the audacity as a black man to show up at our university and think he's actually going to attend class? Is this man crazy? Unfortunately, not all of America, but this southern swath of states, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, into South Carolina, that was still a predominant way of life all the way up to 1960. We thought it was bad and roll of thunder in the 1930s. This stuff was still happening. Another generation And it's still happening until 1965. So he's met with violence. 2 people actually get killed in the protest. President Kennedy actually has to order the U.S. Army to go to Oxford, to the University of Mississippi, to restore order. Why? Because of all the hate and venom of people that are so set on determined not to let black people have an equal standing in their society. Over 100 years, or almost 100 years after the Civil War. And that led to that doesn't lead to the missile crisis. That's an ongoing issue. 2 issues: Cold War, race relations. Back to the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis. When people think of the Kennedy administration, there's 2 things that immediately come to their mind. Well, 3 things: Bay of Pigs, Cuban Missile Crisis, the beginning of Vietnam. We learned that actually the kind of beginning of Vietnam was way back in Eisenhower administration, 1955, with the battle at, everything changed with Dien Bien Phu. And that's when the French were booted out of Indochina, and we had this area, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. What's going to happen to that place? Who's going to fill the void that French leadership had? Well, guess who wants to? The commies, right? Russia would love to just move in there. Even China love to move in there and take control of that area of the world. Well, what if we let that happen? Why does America care? What was Eisenhower's theory? Again, the domino theory, right? Why should America care if a place they never heard of, back then they never heard of it, 90% of Americans, Vietnam, what? What's that? Of course you know what it is, right? Because there was a war. Laos, what? Cambodia? Why would we care? Well, because it might be one little place, right? And then the next little place, and then the next little place, and then the next little place. The next thing you know, the Soviet Union has not just control of their huge empire they have in Eastern Europe and into Western Asia, all the way down to the Middle East. Now they've got bases and control of Southeast Asia. Where's that? Oh, Cuba? What? Is this okay? Should America be concerned about dictatorial tyranny engulfing the world? You betcha. So in October 1962, I can't overplay this. I wasn't alive, but I talked to many people that were alive, and your grandparents, some of them, great-grandparents were definitely alive, and they will remember, if you talk to them, what it was like on the last full week of October 1962. How tense was it, Grandpa? Do you remember bomb drill, shelter drills when you were in school? Like, was it really like the history teacher said, that the whole country was on edge, thinking that we could literally be going into nuclear war, having an exchange of nuclear weapons between the United States and Russia? Yes, it got that tense. People glued to their, more and more televisions getting in living rooms, right? People glued to the news, the newspaper, the television, the radios. What is happening today? Kind of like we were a couple weeks ago with Ukraine, right? But this was like right here. This was like right in our backyard. This was Cuba. People were really, really afraid that something was going to happen. You had 2 superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, and for 20 years almost after the World War II, there was this battle of ideas, right? And we had Korea. We weren't really fighting each other. And now they were like face to face. Were they actually going to start exchanging weapons? And a lot of people thought they were. Now, Nikita Khrushchev, that's the leader of Russia. That's probably going to be on the test. Nikita Khrushchev, Soviet premier. They don't call him president, but premier. Well, what happens when your enemy sense weakness? Some theorize that what's happened over the last month is because Russia sensed weakness. Like it or not, we're the dominant superpower in the world. And if America's kind of, sorry for the pun, asleep at the wheel, maybe now's the time to go in and take what we want from what we rightfully think is ours anyway, Ukraine. So what happened was the Russians under Khrushchev, we found out through our intelligence networks that the Russians are putting nuclear missiles in Cuba. What? It's one thing to worry about, hey, would they be able to launch a missile from halfway around the world and hit the United States? Probably, maybe. How accurate would it be? How about if they're only 90 miles away and they've got missiles that they can launch at any time? Push the button and the missile goes off and it could reach what? Probably any city in the United States, right? Pick their target. They're only 90 miles away. Should we be concerned about that? So we find out about it. They deny it, of course. Isn't that the way it always works? They deny, like President Reagan says, trust but verify. So they deny it. We end up getting satellite or our planes. Well, we got satellites too. We get images of, he said they weren't there. Here they are. We set up a blockade. Dozens of ships circle Cuba, trying to make sure, not trying, we're going to make sure, no Russian ships can get through. We don't want any more Russian supplies going to Cuba. Russia sends ships. Here's our ships circling Cuba, and here comes Russian ships. Are they actually going to try to go through our blockade? Can it go out? And this is what the reports were like back then.
2022 is the year of you. Make it the year you start.
You. That's all I hear. Me, you. Come on. Here we go spinning. Hey, by the way, side note, it's been said that this guy could have been a major league ball player. Fidel Castro. What'd you say? Cuba's pretty good baseball? Yeah.
In 1959, Fidel Castro took control of the island nation of Cuba, established Cuba as a communist nation, and began forging a close relationship with the Soviet Union, which concerned the United States.
Yeah.
In April of 1961, the United States made an attempt to remove Castro from power. The U.S. trained Cuban exiles who had escaped Castro by moving to Florida and supported them in an invasion of Cuba. This became known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. The invasion failed, and Castro continued to tighten his grip over Cuba. In August of 1962, the Cubans and Soviets began secretly establishing sites to launch nuclear missiles from Cuba. With the use of these missile bases, the Soviet Union could have first strike capability against the United States. On October 15th, the United States discovered the existence of these missiles. President John F. Kennedy and his advisors considered several different strategies, ranging from diplomacy to a blockade, or even a full-scale invasion of Cuba. President Kennedy eventually chose a blockade. The U.S. Navy placed ships in the Caribbean Sea surrounding Cuba and would not allow any Soviet ships to reach Cuba. On October 22nd, Kennedy announced the threat to the nation, causing panic and turmoil across the country. Throughout the next several days, the crisis continued to escalate as both sides refused to back down. The United States insisted that the missile bases be removed, while the Soviet Union and Cuba refused to admit that the bases even existed. As the days continued, the Soviet Union remained diligent, and the Kennedy administration began preparing for the early stages of an invasion plan. On October 20,
Think about what Kennedy's going through at this time, right? One of the first things that happens in his first 100 days is the Bay of Pigs. It's in Cuba. It's a failure. And now he's having to go before the people a year later and say, by the way, we might have to take really strong action against the Soviets if they continue to try to put their missiles in Cuba. What a headache that had to be.
25th, the blockade was challenged for the first time. Soviet ships approached the quarantine zone, but American ships held their ground. The Soviet vessels were forced to turn back, and the blockade continued. On that same day, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson, confronted the Soviets in the UN Assembly, revealing photographic evidence that forced the Soviet Union to admit the missile bases existed. The crisis finally ended on October 28, 1962, when President Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev reached a secret agreement. The Soviets would remove their missile bases in Cuba, and in exchange, the United States would remove missile bases in Turkey, which were close to the Soviet Union's borders.
Does that add a different element to the story? Anybody paying attention? First of all, there's good and evil in the world, right? But if you're the leaders of the Soviet Union, what did you just find out from the video? It's still on the screen. What were they just saying? Was anybody paying attention? What did we have? Derek?
This is in Turkey.
You see the Soviet Union on the map? You see where Turkey is? See the Black Sea? By the way, what's that little island in the middle of the Black Sea? That's Crimea, so that's Ukraine. We had missiles in Turkey, and the Soviet Union's like, hey, what are you talking about? You got missiles right there in Turkey. You don't think that we know that you can launch those and hit us? Mr. Franken has not taken the Russian side. I'm just telling you from their perspective, right? They're the enemy, but from their perspective, they were like using that as a negotiation. Okay, we'll take ours out of Cuba. You get yours out of Turkey. And we agreed to that because we didn't want them 90 miles from us, right? Now, it's war, right? It's a Cold War, but it's a war of ideas, and the ideas are big, right? If communism ever took over, life as we know it would not be. That's just a fact. So we're the good guys. So you might think, well, that's not fair that we had missiles. Guess what? We're on a mission to save the world from communist dictatorship where literally hundreds of millions of people have died over the last century. I think we have the upper hand here morally. Anyway, just in case you didn't know that that was part of the negotiation.
To this day, the Cuban Missile Crisis is regarded as the closest that the United States has ever come to nuclear war. The event was one of the most intense moments in the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, and one of the defining moments of the Cold War.
How about that technology? Right there in the White House. See that big screen TV he's got? A little black and white box. That's even the president's television. Questions, comments? No? See if we can catch up the second period. Back to race relations. Constant concern about communism, constant concern about what's going on in the South when it comes to their continuation of the Civil War. Well, Birmingham, what state? Birmingham, Alabama becomes ground zero for what is going to become, ultimately, when it comes to the legal process, the end of this nonsense. Because by 1965, it's going to be etched in stone in America that you cannot, no more loopholes from these southern states, no more ways around it. You cannot, will not, ever legally, no state can sanction and pretend that it's okay or insist that it's legal to discriminate against people based on the color of their skin. Who's MLK? Martin Luther King. So this is kind of, he comes, I mean, he's known, but he's really going to come to prominence in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, in the spring of 63, as he goes and joins them in their peaceful protest. Fortunately / unfortunately, why would I say fortunately? Because they're going to be met by the safety commissioner in Birmingham, Alabama, a guy that goes by the name of Bull Connor. So I don't know the guy personally, but I'm imagining he's probably a pretty big dude. A guy that's got the nickname Bull Connor probably looks pretty intimidating, right? More than looking intimidating, he is definitely intimidating if you're a black person in Mississippi, because again, his mindset is still back in 1863. Black people, you should know your place. It definitely isn't in University of Mississippi, and it's definitely not at the same water fountain as my children here in Birmingham, Alabama. You have your own water fountain, remember, separate but equal. You've got your own places to go to have lunch. You don't need to be coming into our diners. The audacity to think you're going to go and stay at you should be able to go and stay at a hotel with white people. So this is what they're met with. And they're met with not only that intimidation and using the law, again, these states, primarily, if you go across the South, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, those are the ones that are most frequently talked about, that they just couldn't give it up. Have you seen videos of people getting hosed with fire hoses and dogs? They bring dogs. I said, fortunately, unfortunately, the fortunate part was more and more people are getting televisions in their homes, right? So if you're up here living in Ohio, like I was born almost at this time, if you're up here living in Ohio, you're like, what are they doing down there? Honestly, if you're living in Pennsylvania, Ohio, New York, a northern state, and you're not like really out, you don't have relatives down there, it was like living in two different countries. Like, what are they still doing down there? But this brings it into your living room. So people that were living in New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, they turn on their TVs for the evening news, and they're seeing black people just marching down the street, arm in arm, Martin Luther King Jr. out front, peacefully, not bothering anyone, just marching down the street, just to kind of show that, hey, this stuff has to end, right? And what do they see? They see the authorities in Birmingham turning fire hoses on them, having their dogs go into the crowd and get them out to break up their protest, a legal, peaceful protest, part of our Constitution. That's you're allowed to peaceably assemble, right? And the people are seeing this in their living room. So it's kind of like good. It was good in a way that it was happening at a time where people could see it, right? Because what's that going to lead to? That's going to lead to a really rapid, it's really going to speed up the process here, because you're going to have thousands of people coming from the north going down to join the protesters in the south saying, you people this has to change. This is America. Mississippi was like, oh yeah, we're in America, but we're Mississippians and we're going to do it the way we want to. So it's finally going to change. And after this relatively short time. Questions, comments? So before we get this next couple notes here, before we get to, we'll end this tomorrow with the unfortunate ending of the presidency of JFK, when, as you all know, he's going to be assassinated. This is just kind of to give you an idea of what the culture was like back then. It was like people getting assassinated all the time. You may know that President Kennedy's brother is going to get assassinated a few years after he does, right? What was going on in the 60s in America? Those crazy times, right? You think these are crazy times. You had one of the civil rights leaders named Medgar Evers, I got him in bold, remember that name, that in June of 63, he's do you remember what NAACP stands for? National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. That was an organization started to get this civil rights thing moving. Well, he's killed at his home in Jackson, Mississippi. Hey, this guy's being way too vocal and gaining way too much influence and power. We got to take him out, so they kill him. Back to Birmingham. 4 members of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, were suspected and arrested for the bombing of a black church, Baptist church in Birmingham, Alabama, that 4 young girls, they're not even adults, they're just kids, at the church are killed in the bombing. Dozens of other people injured. No convictions. Who's running the show? People like Bull Connor, right? So they arrested these 4 people they suspected of putting the dynamite in the basement of the church, but they never got convicted. You got to get through the network of prosecuting attorneys. Were they going to prosecute white guys for blowing up a black church? It's not going to happen. In early 1960s Mississippi. You know the part of Vietnam that we are going to end up supporting when we go to war? Their president gets assassinated 3 weeks before our president. So those notes just to kind of set the stage for what kind of a world that it was in 1960s. So tomorrow we conclude with one of those events like 9/11. Ask your parents, do you remember where you were? Of course they do. They remember exactly where they were, what they were doing on 9/11, right? Ask your grandparents, hey, do you remember JFK being shot? Yep, they'll tell you exactly where they were, what they were doing. November 22nd, 1963. Yes, ma'am. Anybody else got to take the test yet? Truman, Eisenhower. Mrs. Tosh, did you get those? How are you doing?
When and where? Well, not necessarily when. Just where. Yeah, I mean, I work for everybody. By the time we get to the message done now.